Margaret Flynn stood on the train platform clutching a worn leather satchel, her heart hammering against her ribs like a prisoner demanding freedom. The Montana wind whipped her dark hair across her face, and she tucked it behind her ear with trembling fingers. She had traveled over 2,000 miles from Boston, leaving behind the suffocating factory work and the cramped boarding house where she'd spent the last 3 years of her life. The advertisement had promised a new beginning, a respectable marriage to a prosperous rancher named Thomas Whitmore. She had responded with a carefully worded letter, describing her skills in cooking, sewing, and keeping house. She had mentioned her love of reading and her hope for children someday. What she hadn't mentioned was her size. Margaret wasn't delicate like the women in the fashion magazines. She was tall, broad-shouldered, and generously curved in every direction. In Boston, the other factory girls had whispered behind their hands, and the foreman had made comments that burned her cheeks with shame. But Thomas's letters had been kind, speaking of loneliness and the need for companionship in the vast wilderness. He had never asked for a photograph, and she had convinced herself that character mattered more than appearance. Now, as she watched the other passengers disperse into the dusty frontier town, doubt crept through her chest like winter frost. The telegram had been specific. Thomas would meet her at 3 o'clock outside the general store. Margaret checked the silver watch pinned to her bodice, a gift from her late mother, and saw she had 30 minutes. She used the time to freshen up as best she could in the tiny station washroom, pinching color into her pale cheeks and straightening her best traveling dress. The deep blue fabric had seemed elegant in Boston, but here it felt heavy and out of place. She smoothed her hands over her waist, trying to ignore the way the dress pulled across her hips. Perhaps Thomas would be kind. Perhaps he would see past the surface to the woman beneath. When she arrived at the general store, a tall man in a pressed suit stood waiting. His hair was slicked back with pomade, and his mustache was waxed to sharp points. He held a small daguerreotype in his hand, squinting at it and then scanning the street. Margaret's stomach dropped. She recognized the image. It had been taken years ago, before hunger and hardship had softened her features and added flesh to her frame. She approached slowly, her legs feeling like lead. Thomas Whitmore looked up as her shadow fell across him. His eyes traveled from her face down to her feet and back again, his expression shifting from confusion to something darker. Disgust. Margaret had seen that look before, but it had never cut quite so deep. She opened her mouth to speak, to explain, to apologize for existing in a body that displeased him, but he spoke first. "You're not what I ordered," he said flatly, as though she were a piece of furniture delivered in the wrong color. His voice carried across the street, and several townspeople turned to stare. The advertisement promised a proper wife, not a woman who clearly can't control herself at the dinner table. "I run a respectable ranch. What would people think?" The words struck like physical blows. Margaret's vision blurred with tears she refused to let fall. She had spent her last dollar on the train ticket. She had no family, no home to return to, nothing but the clothes on her back and the hope that had sustained her through 3 days of travel. That hope was now dying in the dust of this godforsaken Montana street. Thomas turned away without another word, mounting a fine black horse tied nearby. He rode off toward the edge of town, leaving Margaret standing alone with her satchel and her shattered dreams. The townspeople resumed their business, though she caught whispers and sidelong glances. Shame flooded through her, hot and poisonous. She had been rejected before, but never with such public cruelty. Never after coming so far. As the sun began its descent toward the mountains, Margaret realized she had nowhere to go. The boarding house would require payment she didn't have. The train back east was equally impossible. She sank onto a bench outside the general store, fighting the despair that threatened to swallow her whole. The frontier was supposed to be a place where people could reinvent themselves, where the past didn't matter and hard work could build a future. But apparently, even here, some things never changed. The sun had painted the sky in shades of orange and purple by the time Margaret accepted her situation. She would have to find work, any work, and sleep wherever she could until she'd earned enough for a room. Pride was a luxury she could no longer afford. She rose from the bench, straightening her spine despite the weight of humiliation pressing down on her shoulders. Her mother had always said that dignity wasn't about circumstances, it was about how you carried yourself through them. As she turned toward the general store to inquire about employment, a massive figure emerged from the trading post across the street. The man stood well over 6 feet tall, with shoulders that seemed to span the width of the doorway. His flannel shirt was rolled to the elbows, revealing forearms thick with muscle and marked with old scars. Dark hair fell across his forehead, and a beard covered the lower half of his face. But it was his eyes that caught her attention, deep brown and startlingly gentle in such a rugged face. He carried an axe over one shoulder as casually as another man might carry a walking stick. Their eyes met across the street, and Margaret quickly looked away, her face burning. She couldn't bear another moment of judgment, another measuring gaze that found her wanting. But when she glanced back, the man was still watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. It wasn't the cold assessment Thomas had given her, nor was it the pity she'd seen from the townspeople. It was something else entirely. Something that made her breath catch in her throat. The man crossed the street with long, purposeful strides. As he approached, Margaret noticed the way people stepped aside for him, offering respectful nods. He stopped a few feet away, his presence somehow both intimidating and comforting. Up close, she could see flecks of sawdust in his beard and the calluses on his hands that spoke of hard labor. "Name's Jacob," he said, his voice a deep rumble like distant thunder. "Jacob Brennan. I'm a timber man up in the mountains. I saw what happened with Whitmore." He paused, his jaw tightening beneath his beard. "That man's a fool, and I wanted you to know that not everyone in this town shares his narrow way of thinking." Margaret blinked back fresh tears at the unexpected kindness. "I'm Margaret Flynn," she managed, her voice barely above a whisper. "I appreciate your words, Mr. Brennan, but I'm afraid they don't change my circumstances. I have no money, no place to stay, and apparently no prospects." Jacob shifted the axe to his other shoulder, his brow furrowing in thought. "The widow Patterson runs the boarding house on Elm Street. She's a good woman, fair and decent. I could speak to her about extending credit until you find work. There's always need for seamstresses and cooks in a town like this." The offer was so unexpectedly generous that Margaret felt her composure crack. A single tear escaped down her cheek before she could stop it. She wiped it away quickly, embarrassed. "Why would you help me? You don't know anything about me." "I know you had the courage to travel halfway across the country for a chance at a better life," Jacob said simply. "I know you're standing here with your head up despite being treated shamefully. That tells me plenty." He glanced toward the mountains in the distance, where the last rays of sunlight gilded the peaks. "I also know what it's like to be judged unfairly. People see my size and assume I'm nothing but brute strength. They don't expect me to read poetry or know the names of wildflowers. Seems to me you might understand something about that." Margaret stared at this unexpected ally, this gentle giant who spoke of poetry in the same breath as timber work. "I would be grateful for any help you could offer, Mr. Brennan. I promise I'll repay your kindness however I can." Jacob nodded, a small smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "It's Jacob, please. And I'm not looking for repayment. Come on, let's get you settled before full dark. These mountain nights get cold fast, and you've had a rough enough day." As they walked through the dusty streets toward the boarding house, Margaret felt the tightness in her chest ease slightly. Jacob moved with surprising grace for such a large man, and he kept his pace slow to match hers. He pointed out various establishments, the bakery owned by a Swedish couple, the blacksmith who could fix anything, the schoolhouse where the teacher was looking for an assistant. He spoke easily, his deep voice washing over her like warm water, melting away some of the ice that had formed around her heart. When they reached the boarding house, a tidy white building with blue shutters, Jacob knocked firmly. The door opened to reveal a woman in her 50s with silver-streaked hair and sharp, intelligent eyes. Her gaze moved from Jacob to Margaret and back again, taking in the situation with the quickness of someone accustomed to reading people. "Evening, Widow Patterson," Jacob said respectfully. "This is Miss Margaret Flynn. She's new to town and in need of a room. I'm willing to vouch for her character and cover her board until she finds employment." The widow's eyes softened as she looked at Margaret more carefully, seeing past the rumpled traveling dress and tear-stained face. "I heard about what happened with Whitmore. That man has the heart of a stone and the brain of a chicken. Come in, dear. Any friend of Jacob's is welcome here." Margaret's room at the boarding house was small but clean, with a narrow bed covered in a patchwork quilt and a window that overlooked the street. As she unpacked her meager belongings that first night, she felt the full weight of the day settle onto her shoulders. She had been so certain that Montana would be her fresh start, her escape from the judgment and limitations of her old life. Instead, she had found the same prejudices dressed in different clothes, living in a different landscape. The only bright spot in the entire disaster was Jacob Brennan, whose kindness felt like a lifeline thrown to a drowning woman. Sleep came fitfully, broken by dreams of Thomas Whitmore's disgusted face and the whispers of the townspeople. When dawn broke through her window, Margaret forced herself out of bed and dressed carefully. If she was going to survive here, she needed to find work immediately. She couldn't continue accepting Jacob's charity, no matter how freely offered. Pride might be a luxury, but self-sufficiency was a necessity. Widow Patterson had breakfast waiting in the dining room, fresh biscuits, eggs, and strong coffee that cleared the fog from Margaret's mind. 2 other boarders sat at the table, both miners who nodded politely before returning to their meal. The widow sat beside Margaret, her sharp eyes missing nothing. "I've been thinking about your situation," she said without preamble. "My sister runs the dress shop on Main Street. She's been complaining about how much work she has since the railroad brought more people to town. Can you sew?" Margaret nodded eagerly. "I worked in a garment factory in Boston for 3 years. I can sew, mend, alter, and even design if needed." "Good. I'll send word to her this morning. She's particular about her work, but she's fair. If you can prove your skill, she'll pay decent wages." The widow poured more coffee into Margaret's cup. "Now, about Jacob. He's a good man, one of the best in this town. Don't let his size or his rough appearance fool you. He's got a poet's soul trapped in a lumberjack's body." The comment made Margaret smile despite her lingering sadness. "He was very kind to me yesterday. I don't know what I would have done without his help." "Jacob sees people clearly," the widow said thoughtfully. "Always has. While others are busy looking at surfaces, he's paying attention to what matters. There's a reason everyone in this town respects him, even though he keeps mostly to himself up in those mountains." The dress shop job materialized by mid-morning. Mrs. Clementine Howard, the widow's sister, was a brisk woman with measuring eyes and quick hands. She tested Margaret's skills with a series of increasingly difficult tasks, hemming a delicate silk dress, repairing a torn seam invisibly, adjusting the fit of a jacket. Margaret worked with focused intensity, letting her hands remember the skills she'd honed during those long factory years. When she finished, Mrs. Howard examined each piece with exacting scrutiny before nodding her approval. "You'll do," she said simply. 6 days a week, 8 to 6, with an hour for lunch. Wages are $1 a day to start, more if you prove yourself valuable. I expect punctuality, quality work, and discretion about my customers. Can you meet those terms?" "Yes." "Thank you for the opportunity." The work was demanding but satisfying. Margaret fell into a routine over the following days, rising early, working until her fingers ached, returning to the boarding house for dinner, then falling into exhausted sleep. The other townspeople remained distant, though she caught fewer hostile looks than she'd feared. Some of the women who came into the shop for fittings were kind, treating her with professional courtesy. Others were cold, their voices clipped when they spoke to her. Margaret kept her head down and focused on her work, letting her skill speak for itself. Jacob appeared on her 3rd evening in town, knocking on the boarding house door just as dinner was being served. Widow Patterson invited him to join them, and he sat across from Margaret at the long table. His presence seemed to fill the room, yet he moved carefully, aware of his size in the confined space. He asked about her job, listened attentively to her descriptions of the shop, and shared stories about his work in the timber camps. "The mountains are beautiful this time of year," he said, his voice taking on a warmer tone. "The aspens are turning gold, and the air smells like pine and coming snow. It's quiet up there, peaceful. Sometimes I go days without seeing another soul, just me and the trees and the occasional deer or elk." "It sounds lonely," Margaret said softly. Jacob considered this, his dark eyes thoughtful. "Lonely and solitary aren't the same thing. I chose the mountains because I like the silence, the simplicity. But I won't lie, there are times I wish I had someone to share it with. Someone who could appreciate the beauty without needing constant entertainment or comfort." Their eyes met across the table, and something passed between them, a recognition, an understanding. Margaret felt her pulse quicken. She looked away first, confused by the intensity of her reaction. She barely knew this man. He was being kind, nothing more. Yet there was something about him that called to a deep part of her, something she thought had died in the dust outside the general store. Over the next 2 weeks, Jacob became a regular presence at the boarding house dinners. He always found reasons to be in town, supplies to purchase, tools to repair, business with the timber merchant. Margaret suspected the reasons were partly fabricated, but she couldn't bring herself to mind. His company had become the highlight of her days. They talked about everything: books they'd read, places they'd seen, dreams they'd harbored. Jacob had a way of listening that made her feel heard, truly heard, perhaps for the first time in her life. The first snow came early that year, dusting the mountains in white and bringing a sharp bite to the air. Margaret had been in Montana for 6 weeks, and her life had found a rhythm that felt almost comfortable. Mrs. Howard had raised her wages after the first month, pleased with her skill and reliability. The other townspeople had grown accustomed to her presence, and while she wouldn't call them friendly, they'd stopped staring. She'd even made a tentative friend in Sarah Chen, who ran the bakery with her husband and shared Margaret's love of reading. Jacob continued his regular visits, though he'd had to reduce their frequency as winter approached. The timber work grew more demanding as he rushed to finish projects before the heavy snows made the mountain roads impassable. But when he did come to town, he sought out Margaret's company with a consistency that made her heart flutter with dangerous hope. She tried to guard herself against expectation, reminding herself that kindness wasn't the same as romantic interest. Yet she couldn't ignore the way his face lit up when he saw her, or the way his fingers lingered when he helped her with her coat. One Saturday evening in late November, Jacob arrived at the boarding house with an unusual request. "Tomorrow's Sunday," he said, standing in the doorway with snowflakes melting in his beard. "I wondered if you might like to see my cabin. The road's still passable for another week or two, and I thought you might enjoy the view. I could show you the aspens I mentioned, and there's a waterfall that's partially frozen now. It's beautiful in a harsh sort of way." Margaret hesitated, aware of the impropriety of visiting a bachelor's home unchaperoned. But the longing in his voice, the hope in his eyes, made her abandon caution. "I'd like that very much," she said quietly. They set out the next morning in Jacob's sturdy wagon, pulled by two massive draft horses that seemed perfectly suited to their owner. The journey took 3 hours, climbing steadily into the mountains along a road that grew narrower and rougher with each mile. Jacob handled the horses with expert ease, pointing out landmarks and sharing stories about the various peaks and valleys. The higher they climbed, the more magnificent the views became. Vast forests stretched in every direction, broken only by rocky outcroppings and the occasional clearing. The sky was impossibly blue against the white-capped peaks. Jacob's cabin sat in a clearing surrounded by towering pines. It was larger than Margaret had expected, built from massive logs that spoke of Jacob's skill with timber. Smoke curled from the stone chimney, and a covered porch ran along the front. The setting was breathtakingly beautiful, isolated yet somehow welcoming. Inside, the cabin was surprisingly cozy. A large stone fireplace dominated one wall, with comfortable chairs arranged before it. Bookshelves lined another wall, stuffed with volumes that ranged from technical manuals to poetry collections. The kitchen area was tidy and well-equipped, and through an open door, Margaret glimpsed a bedroom with a massive bed that had clearly been built to accommodate Jacob's size. "It's wonderful," she breathed, turning slowly to take it all in. "You built all this yourself?" "Most of it," Jacob said, a note of pride in his voice. "Took me 3 years, working between jobs. I wanted something solid, something that would last. A home, not just a shelter." He moved to the fireplace, stoking the fire until it blazed warmly. "Let me show you the waterfall before we lose the light." They walked through the forest along a narrow trail, their breath forming clouds in the cold air. Margaret's skirts dragged in the snow, but she didn't care. The peace of the mountains had seeped into her bones, quieting the constant anxiety that had plagued her since arriving in Montana. Here, removed from the town and its judgments, she felt like she could finally breathe. The waterfall was exactly as Jacob had described, a cascade of water partially frozen into glittering ice, creating a sculpture that seemed too beautiful to be natural. They stood on a flat rock, watching the water flow around and through the ice, listening to the music it made. Jacob stood close beside her, his warmth radiating in the cold air. "Margaret," he said suddenly, his deep voice cutting through the sound of the falls. "I need to tell you something, and I'm not sure how to say it properly, so I'm just going to speak plain." She turned to face him, her heart hammering. His expression was serious, vulnerable in a way she'd never seen before. "I know we haven't known each other long," he continued, "and I know your experience with Whitmore has probably made you cautious about trusting men in this territory. But I can't let another week pass without telling you that I care for you. More than care, I think I'm falling in love with you. You're brave and kind and strong, and when I'm with you, this cabin doesn't feel lonely anymore. It feels like it's waiting for something. For someone." Margaret's eyes filled with tears, but for once they were tears of joy rather than pain. "Jacob, Wait, let me finish," he said gently. "I know I'm not what most women dream of. I'm rough around the edges, I live in the middle of nowhere, and I make my living with my hands and my back. But I promise you this, I would never judge you for your size or your appearance or anything else so shallow. I see you, Margaret. The real you. And she's exactly what I've been looking for." The words broke through the last of Margaret's defenses. She stepped forward, closing the distance between them, and laid her hand against his chest. She could feel his heart beating rapidly beneath her palm. I see you too, Jacob. And I care for you more than I thought possible in such a short time. When I'm with you, I feel like myself, not the version of me I have to pretend to be to make others comfortable, but the actual me. Jacob's face transformed with joy. He reached up slowly, giving her time to pull away, and cupped her face in his large, calloused hands. May I kiss you? He asked, his voice rough with emotion. Yes, Margaret whispered, and then his lips were on hers, gentle despite his size, tender despite his rough exterior. The kiss deepened, and Margaret felt herself melting into his embrace. His arms came around her, strong and protective, making her feel safe in a way she'd never experienced before. When they finally pulled apart, both were breathing heavily, their breath mingling in the cold air. They walked back to the cabin hand in hand, stopping frequently to kiss again, to whisper words of affection, to marvel at this unexpected turn of fate. Inside, Jacob made tea while Margaret curled up in one of the comfortable chairs by the fire. The domesticity of the moment wasn't lost on either of them. This was what life could be like, should be like, if they chose to build it together. I want to court you properly, Jacob said, settling into the chair beside hers. I want to do this right. I'll come to town every Sunday, and we'll take walks and have dinners and let people see that I'm serious about my intentions. Then, when you're ready, I want to marry you. I want you here with me, sharing this life I've built. I want to wake up beside you every morning and fall asleep listening to your breathing every night. Margaret's heart felt too full for her chest. What about the town? What about people's opinions? They already whispered about me after what happened with Thomas. If I marry you so quickly, they'll talk. Let them talk, Jacob said firmly. I stopped caring about other people's opinions years ago. The ones who matter, Widow Patterson, the Chens, Mrs. Howard, they'll be happy for us. The rest can think whatever they like. Their small-mindedness is their problem, not ours. They stayed at the cabin until the sun began to set, talking about their dreams and plans. Jacob wanted to expand the cabin, adding a proper bedroom and a larger kitchen. Margaret talked about her love of gardening and her hope of cultivating vegetables in the mountain soil. They discussed books they wanted to read together, places they might visit someday, the possibility of children. Every shared dream felt like another thread weaving their lives together. The ride back to town that evening was peaceful, both of them lost in their own thoughts yet connected by Jacob's arm around Margaret's shoulders. When they reached the boarding house, he helped her down from the wagon and kissed her again under the street lamp, not caring who might see. Next Sunday? He asked. Next Sunday, she confirmed. And every Sunday after that. True to his word, Jacob courted Margaret with patient determination throughout the winter. He appeared every Sunday without fail, bringing small gifts, a book of poetry, a carved wooden bird, wildflowers he'd somehow found blooming in a protected valley. They took walks through the snow-covered town, attended church services together, and had dinner at the boarding house with Widow Patterson smiling knowingly at them. The townspeople did talk, but the gossip was surprisingly kind. People seemed charmed by the sight of the massive lumberjack and the substantial woman, both of them so clearly in love that it softened even the hardest hearts. Mrs. Howard became Margaret's unexpected champion. About time someone saw what an asset you are, she said one day at the shop. Jacob Brennan's a good man, one of the best. You make a fine pair, both of you strong enough to handle what life throws at you. The proposal came in early spring, when the mountain roads had cleared enough for Jacob to take Margaret back to the cabin. He'd spent the winter months adding onto the structure, and he wanted to show her the results. The new bedroom had windows that looked out over the valley, and the kitchen was twice its previous size, with a large table Jacob had built himself. I made it big enough for a family, he said, running his hand over the smooth wood. For you and me and however many children we're blessed with. I made it strong enough to last generations. And I made it with love in every nail and board, thinking about the life we're going to build here together. He dropped to one knee then, pulling a simple gold band from his pocket. Margaret Flynn, will you marry me? Will you take a chance on this rough mountain man and help him turn this cabin into a home? Margaret dropped to her knees in front of him, ignoring the impropriety, and took his face in her hands. Yes. 1,000 times yes. You're not taking a chance on me, Jacob. We're choosing each other, deliberately and completely. They married 6 weeks later in the small church in town. Widow Patterson stood as Margaret's witness, and one of Jacob's fellow timber men stood for him. Sarah Chen provided the cake, decorated with delicate sugar flowers. Margaret wore a dress she'd made herself, deep green like the mountain pines, fitted to her body without apology or shame. She was done hiding herself, done apologizing for taking up space in the world. As Jacob slipped the ring onto her finger and kissed her for the first time as her husband, Margaret thought back to that terrible day on the dusty street when Thomas Whitmore had rejected her. She'd felt like her world was ending, like she would never recover from the humiliation and the loss of her dreams. She hadn't known then that those dreams were too small, too limited by her own wounded expectations. She hadn't known that something infinitely better was waiting in the mountains, a love that saw her completely and chose her anyway. A partner who was her perfect match not in spite of their size and strength, but because of it. A life built on mutual respect, genuine affection, and the understanding that true beauty has nothing to do with meeting society's narrow standards. Jacob lifted her in his arms, making her laugh, and carried her down the church aisle. The townspeople clapped and cheered, and even those who had whispered unkindly in the beginning seemed moved by the obvious happiness radiating from the couple. Outside, the spring sun was warm on their faces, and the mountains stood tall in the distance, waiting to welcome them home. That evening, as they sat on the cabin porch watching the sunset paint the peaks in shades of gold and pink, Margaret leaned against Jacob's solid warmth and felt a peace she'd never known existed. She'd come west looking for a husband, for security, for a chance to escape her past. Instead, she'd found something far more valuable, she'd found herself. And in the process, she'd found a love strong enough to weather any storm, deep enough to last a lifetime, and true enough to prove that the right person sees not what you look like, but who you are. "What are you thinking about?" Jacob asked softly, his arm tightening around her. "I'm thinking that I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be," Margaret answered. "And I'm thinking that Thomas Whitmore did me the greatest favor of my life when he rejected me. Because if he hadn't, I never would have found you." Jacob kissed the top of her head, his contentment evident in every line of his body. "His loss was my gain. And I promise you, Margaret, I will spend every day of our lives making sure you know how lucky I am that you chose me." They sat in comfortable silence as darkness fell over the mountains, two people who had each been judged and found wanting by a world that valued the wrong things. Together, they had created something beautiful, a partnership based on acceptance, a love built on seeing and being seen. The mail-order bride who had been rejected for her size had found her perfect match not in the rancher who wanted an ornament, but in the lumberjack who wanted a partner. And in the end, that made all the difference.